to keep it out of here. I don't want to see it ever again. And we try to find a balance between all those personalities and that entire spectrum. And with about 50 or 60 years worth of science behind it, we're kind of come up with an approach on how to deal with wildlife problems and how to move forward and try to alleviate some of them and potentially solve them, or also recognizing when a solution is going to be really difficult and how then do you overcome that block there of not being able to find a direct solution. How do you deal with that? So with that being said, I'm going to pull up my talk here and probably break in some copyright issues with my title slide, but all right. Everybody see that screen? We're good?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
All right. Jeremy, I don't know if you can monitor the chat pod. If somebody pops a question up, I don't have that up, so I won't be able to see it. So if you want to or if you do have a question, feel free to interrupt and let me know. I'd be happy to stop and talk about it. So in many ways, when we deal with wildlife, I think this picture pretty much sums it up. I'm guessing I have at least the correct age demographic here to at least know where this is coming from. Sometimes now I give talks with the youth, and if I throw a picture like this in, it's just completely lost. I thankfully am right at that age where I could still appreciate the humor that this brings. But with that said, let's get into how do we, basically live with wildlife. That's really what we're doing. When we talk about, I didn't really think about having Virginia on. I don't know why here, but I'm glad you're here. But specifically in Kentucky, and Virginia is not immune to this. Virginia probably actually has more species than we do because they have the coast and a couple different habitat types than we do. But really, we have hundreds of species of wildlife within Kentucky, ranging in size from toads and frogs and salamanders all the way up to our 850-pound bull elk. And the big thing here is the way we have to look at wildlife and how we approach wildlife management is that we view wildlife as a public resource, which kind of changes how you would potentially approach that if you were, say, in Europe or Africa, where wildlife is viewed as owned by the person where that wildlife is found. So if it's on their property, they own it. We view it as the wildlife, despite being on someone's property, is still owned by the public at large. And that kind of complicates how you manage the resource. Because if it was owned by you, you can just do whatever you need to do to solve the problem. For us, it's different and more complicated. So we have to kind of come up with this thought of how do you then deal with a species causing a problem. And I mentioned not talking about bears, but I always have bears in this slide because it's the one I think people relate to the most. You have to accept that we're not going to be able to eliminate wildlife and all wildlife from our house, our farm, our woods, our garden. There's too many species, and there's so many that are so adaptable to living around humans that you may not have a problem this year, but you're going to have a problem in the future. So understanding that we kind of have to learn to live with wildlife, may have to do a few adjustments on our end, alter our lifestyle a little bit, and maybe try to put a few things in that cause wildlife to alter what they're doing, can really go a long way, both in preventing problems, but also helping wildlife not cause problems. And the example really is when we talk about bears. A lot of our problems come when a bear learns that humans equal food. So if you can keep that knowledge from getting into their head, that fear of humans will win out every time. But if they're hungry and they know there's food in a trash can, or they know there's food, being handed to them out somebody's car window or in a dumpster, then they're going to go after that food in the long run and cause a big issue. So trying to find a way to keep that behavior from starting is going to go a long way in solving the overall problem and hopefully saving that bear's life, because a fed bear is a dead bear. And that's really the ones that cause most of the problems. So little solutions. I know some of these are more costly, but there's some behavioral things that you can do. You can buy the bear-proof garbage containers, right? Or you can keep your trash locked up and secure before it gets picked up. So try putting it out the day of it being picked up. goes a long way than keeping it outside in the open area where bears have easy access to it. And you always have to remember that bears are really just big raccoons. The raccoon is the closest relative, so it's a 200-pound raccoon. So anything a raccoon will do, a bear will do. So most of our solutions for dealing with wildlife come down to understanding what wildlife species is causing the problem, which sounds pretty straightforward, but it can really be complicated. And a lot of that has to do with the number of species that we have present and then the wide variety of the way they behave, even within their own species. So individuals within the same species may behave quite differently. And their health condition can play a role, and many other variables external to, say, a specific species. But there's a few things that you should think about. And so if you're experiencing wildlife issue, or you think you're experiencing wildlife issue, to get to a potential solution, you have to know what animal you're dealing with, what animal is causing the problem. So how do we do that on we have hundreds of species, so I can't go through each individual situation. So how do you do that? What are the steps that you can take to try to narrow it down, not knowing what the problem is? So you can start off by looking around and saying, what habitat do I have around where the problem is occurring? And that'll kind of help narrow it down a little bit, but it really is kind of a stepping stone down to where you want to solve the problem. You're narrowing the path down to a potential solution. So you think about it, if you're having an issue with wildlife in a tree, though a beaver really could cause a tree problem, if you are nowhere near a water body, say a half mile or more, there's very unlikely a beaver is causing a problem with a tree that far from a water body. So that can kind of help. It could be many other things, but you at least can narrow down one potential suspect. And the same kind of holds true with a lot of other habitat types. Just like it's unlikely to be say, you have damage up in a tree, it's unlikely to be something like a skunk if there's damage in, 5-6 feet up a tree. Whereas, if you have a mulberry tree, you sometimes don't even think about what the culprits could be, because something like a groundhog can easily climb a tree, though they're rarely seen in them. It's a lot of people are caught off guard by that. So looking at where the damage is occurring, if it's on plants, is it close to the ground, up top of the ground? Is it on the end of the branch? Is it on the trunk? If it's on a building, is it on the edge of a building? Is it somewhere and a larger animal can climb up to access? So you kind of have to start putting these little puzzle pieces together that will help say, well, that animal really can't climb, so it can't be the culprit, or that animal doesn't really like to chew on these kind of things, so it's probably not what's going on. Those all kind of play in. And if you look at something specific, like what kind of damage is occurring, you can look for things like teeth marks or bite patterns. So looking at something like a tree branch or a sweet corn stalk can actually tell you a lot about what potential animal is doing the damage. You also can do things like look for tracks, look for scat, use field guides to help ID what you find. You can try to use your agents as a resource, and they'll, if they can't figure it out, they'll come back to me and I'll absolutely answer it. I get a lot of emails with poop in them. Thankfully, it's not mailed in poop anymore, as some of my predecessors have told me they used to get. So now I just get pictures of them, which I'm really grateful for. But other tools that are out there, you have trail cameras that are relatively cheap. The game cameras, you don't need a top of the line game camera that they use for hunting to determine what animal may be causing a problem. So set up the camera on the spot you had the problem and look to see what animals are frequenting that area. So here's some resources that we do have. So this is a simple scat key that we have that if you ask your agent for, I can get to you. And it really just uses size and shape and texture and looking at it. You don't have to pick it up and tear it apart. That freaks some people out. You can visually look at what's going on, use the size reference, and narrow it down to many of the species that cause issues within our states. So here's an example of looking at some damage on an actual plant. So actually here we have, two types of damage going on. One that's somewhat obvious, where we have that end of the tree plant, the tree branch there is torn and is frayed apart. Well, if you look at the one that's actually the stem that's all the way at the top, that also has a bite on it that is slightly angled. Now, the slightly angled one is actually one of our native species, either being a deer or an elk, because this is down in Breathitt County. They lack incisors on their upper jaw, so they make a very distinct angled cut whenever they bite a plant. Now, the bottom one, I kind of skipped ahead and you saw the picture. That actually is some of the free-ranging horses that we had up on the mine. That tree sapling was in a regeneration study, and we were looking to see what animals were feeding upon the trees after we planted them, and we kept seeing damage. Well, it wasn't very consistent with what we expected for our wild ungulates, so it ended up being these horses that were frequenting the plot site. And man, they do a lot more damage than our wild ungulates. I'll tell you that. They were ripping stuff out of the ground. So don't rule out things that, I guess the bigger point here is don't rule out the things that aren't necessarily wildlife. We have livestock issues that can mimic or potentially point you towards wildlife, but all of a sudden when you start looking, other culprits stand out. So once you figure out what is causing the problem, we have this, human dimension, wildlife damage paradigm that we tell, humans to follow, right? People to follow. And it's a set of questions and potential solutions to go through whenever you have a problem. And it always actually starts out with, is it really a problem when you're dealing with any kind of wildlife situation? Is it actually a problem? Because if the answer is yes, then there's a lot of steps that can go into solving that problem. Some of them can be very difficult to obtain success. So the example that's always comes to mind is if you're losing money, right? If you're a agricultural producer and you're losing money, then it's a problem. It's very clear cut. Now, the question I always pose is, well, what happens if you have a black rat snake on your porch? Is that actually a problem? And there are a lot of folks in Kentucky, and probably Virginia too, that'll say, the only good snake is a dead snake. I won't go outside if there's a snake on my porch. And that's fine. That's how people feel. And if that snake being there is not letting you step out on your porch, then it's a problem. But to me, a black rat snake on the porch is probably actually a good thing, because I've had a lot more problems with chipmunks at my house than snakes. So I'd rather see that snake there, because he's probably helping me with the problem that I view as a real situation, where I can't grow sunflowers because the chipmunks eat them all. So sometimes it's a monetary issue and it's straightforward. Sometimes it's a personal values issue. So it can be tricky. The next step that we say is, can I alter my behavior to solve that problem? Okay. Put the trash, lock the trash up so bears can't get into it, is a simple behavior change that goes a long way. It's always easier to alter our behavior than it is to alter wildlife. Wildlife are trying to survive. That's their thing. A lot of what we do is not survival based. It's really, I don't want to say laziness, but it's to make our lives easier rather than survival. Can I alter the habitat or the surroundings for where the problem is occurring to help solve the situation? Can I do things like mow the grass and make it a little bit, any of the smaller animals may be more vulnerable to predation if they're out in the open? Can I put deterrents out there, like visual, chemical? Can I put exclusions in? Those are all altering either the habitat or the surroundings to where the issue is happening. And those can be quite effective in many situations. Finally, the last step we get to is, all right, I've tried all these things and I can't solve the problem. Can I effectively trap or remove that individual or individuals that are causing the issue and solve the problem? And that may be things like effective hunting, trapping. You get into the effective use and the correct of rodenticides, making sure you're following the labels on those products. Those are all ways we can solve a solution. What we don't want to do is say, I have a coyote problem, and go out and shoot every coyote you see, because that's actually working against you. Because the way coyotes work is they set up territories, and those mature animals will actually defend those territories. So if you go in and you have the majority of your coyotes are not causing a problem, and you go in and remove all those coyotes that aren't causing the problem for one juvenile that may be, you've opened the door to let a whole bunch of juveniles in that are probably going to cause more problems in the future. So that's where that really concentrated effort on targeting those individuals that are causing the problem is really important. And we always have to keep in mind that this is a long-term battle, okay? These solutions may work this year, but the way wildlife work is there's animals moving around the landscape. They fill voids, like I mentioned, in the coyotes. So you may have new animals coming in the next year, and you want to look for long-term solutions. Fencing, exclusions are great long-term solutions. However, none of this is 100% perfect. So keep that in mind. So I want to kind of go through some examples, visual examples of those steps. All right. So habitat modification, that step. If you are figuring out that raccoons are a big culprit, and you have things like bird feeders out, or you feed your dogs and cats and there's constantly food out on your back porch, and you're wondering why all of a sudden they're tearing a hole into your attic to den there, it's because they only want to walk 5 feet to get to their food and feel safe. So if you remove that food source, try to put food out for your pets, take it away when they're done eating so that's not sitting out there, that actually can go a long way. Things like removing dead denning trees will help take away a sleeping spot for animals, cover where they feel protected and are less likely to leave the area. It's also things like mowing your grass, keeping spaces wide open around where you're having problems, because wildlife really do not want to be in the open. Now, there's a few species that are fine with it, right? The larger ones that really don't have a whole lot of predators. However, smaller animals like rabbits and groundhogs, even raccoons during the daytime, skunks, they don't want to be out in the open because they could have a predator pick them off. So if you make that area a little bit less hospitable, that can go a long way in solving your problems. And especially true with things like voles. If you have a vole issue or a rabbit issue, groundhog issue, get rid of any cover in the area and make it harder for them to get there. Voles will only go about 15, 20 feet. So if you keep the grass short around your trees that you may have just planted in your orchard, they'll be really unlikely to come in the area. Now, like I said, not impossible. We have vole issues in landscape yards, but there's not a lot of foxes and bobcats around picking them off either. So they lack that predation that kind of causes them not to go in those open areas. The effective use of deterrence and scare devices is another tool that you should keep in mind. Now, there's a lot of them out there. There's no silver bullet. Their effectiveness can vary both by species and temporally. So the same tool will work better on one species than another. The example for that is, we put out coyote decoys on golf courses to keep geese from coming up. However, what it does is it actually attracts coyotes to those decoys. So you may create a different problem. But the big thing to know is that, if you put a decoy out or a deterrent out, like a balloon or a scarecrow, they eventually figure out that it's not actually going to harm them. And that effectiveness really declines relatively quickly. So you can do things to extend that life, like moving them around, switching deterrents or switching devices, using them in combination. That'll help to extend it. But the best thing you can do is put them out at the appropriate time. So if your blueberries are about to become ripe and you want to keep the birds away, don't put the deterrent out until a day or two before the blueberries are ripe. And the birds will pick up on when they're becoming ripe more than you will. So that timing is really important. But if you do it correctly, those balloons may buy you 2 or 3, 4 weeks and allow you to pick 80 to 90% of your ripe fruit rather than losing 60 to 70% of it to the birds. So other visual deterrents, things like lasers. are quite effective. The balloons are working. There's a bunch out there. Even drones are one that we're trying to look at, where you can set them automatically to fly at over crop fields. And they use them on airports already to keep animals off a runway with pretty good effectiveness. So there's a bunch out there, and the big thing though is you always have to keep in mind the cost benefit ratio. So something that costs a lot, you make sure you are making up for that cost and what you're getting back. So the laser that this gentleman is holding in the picture here is about $5,000. So there's not many situations where that pays off. However, if you're at a vineyard, it can actually pay off quite quickly. The auditory ones, propane cannons aren't exactly that expensive. They can irritate your neighbors, but they can be quite effective on things like blackbird roosts, vulture roosts. Unfortunately, deer, coyotes, raccoons, bears, you get about 2 to 3 weeks before they figure out that there's nothing actually wrong. So you can still use the timing wise pretty well. If you can get it there when you need it, it can buy you some protection. However, long term, it's not going to. There's some other chemical repellents. Some of these are really good. Things with therum in them, and also some of the egg solids work really well for non-consumable plants, especially over winter. The only thing that you could use on plants that are for human consumption is capsaicin, which is basically hot sauce, and it's relatively expensive. And honestly, animals' personalities are like ours. I'm sure there's some folks that are watching this right now that like hot sauce. Well, we did some work with soybeans in Southern Illinois where I did my PhD, and there are some deer that really loves hot sauce as well. So it kind of depends on the situation, and it's not perfect. Unfortunately, because of that cost being so high, it really has limited application. The other ones like the chew knot, which is a therum, the egg solids, if you're trying to protect things that are not for consumption, they actually do work quite well. The therum works quite well for deer and rabbits especially. The homemade varieties, things like ivory soap, crushed red peppers, using urine. We always talk about using science to inform what we're teaching. There's not a lot out there, or what's out there is contradictory, which happens a lot in science. What we have seen, there's a recent paper from Ohio that talked about coyote and bobcat urine in deer at bait stations. And what they found was as long as there's ample food in the landscape outside of what you're using as their treatment, which is basically just a pile of corn, as long as there's other food to eat, the deer would avoid the predator urine food. However, if they were food stressed, they were hungry, they would eventually give in and go to that food and consume it because their need to eat was outweighing the potential risk from a predator. So it may work, and usually these are relatively cheap, right? So how much does a bar of soap cost? So if you want to try it, it's not going to hurt your pocketbook. Just don't put all your marbles in one bag, in one basket. So they're an option. Remember, for all of these, we're talking cost benefit. When we look at things like exclosures, that actually usually works out. Up front, there's a lot of costs, but especially for things if you're living or trying to produce crops in a high density deer density area, or an area that doesn't necessarily have a high deer density, but you're, for the Southeast Kentucky and West Virginia or Western Virginia, sorry, you may be growing the only true food source outside of the woods in a very large area. So you don't necessarily have a lot of deer, but you may have a lot of pressure. So want to make sure that you guys are constantly talked about not having a lot of deer, which is true. But if you're growing the only good, high quality food source, you're going to have all the deer in the area coming to you. The only problem with exclosures are things like smaller animals and birds can be quite difficult to exclude, so it's not a perfect solution. But it is one of the more long-term solutions, so you're able to spread that initial cost over many years, and that's how you should think about it. There's several exclosure options, and when you start thinking about deer and elk, you want to make sure you're thinking 8-foot fence or taller. Sometimes it's not necessarily you need an 8-foot fence, but the fence needs to have angles or needs to be in the ground and underground and brought back so that things like coyotes, which are capable climbers, are not able to climb the fence, nor are they able to dig under the fence. Your electric solution will keep those climbers out, but sometimes it doesn't always solve the digging under. So let's take a look at some of the potential solutions that are out there. So the bigger picture there is just regular plastic fencing, and that's 8 foot tall. And if all you're doing is trying to keep deer out, this will work great. It's relatively low cost. It's not going to hold up a whole long time because the UV will actually break down that plastic netting pretty quickly after a couple of years, but it will work and is not a bad solution for a backyard garden. Things like elk may stay out of it. However, a bull elk may get its antlers in there and just rip it to pieces. Or if you have a bear come up to that, man, that's gone. That won't stop anything when it comes to a bear. Now, the smaller pictures are a couple electric fencing options. The bottom picture there is a double line electric fence where you have a hot wire about 18 inches and another hot wire at about 3 feet high. Now that's not very high, so a deer or an elk can very easily jump over that. So with that type of fence, what you actually have to do is train the animals to avoid it, to make it a negative association. And the way you do that is you actually put aluminum foil on the hot wire and paint it with olive oil and peanut butter so that the animals come up and lick it and get a really hard shock. And therefore, you're training them that's an area that they could get shocked. And for the most part, if you do it right and get them trained before food is really limited or they realize what's inside the fence, it'll keep most animals out. The solution we usually talk about for being most effective is the one in the top two pictures on the right there, which is a offset electric fence. And what this is basically a 4-foot-ish interior fence with a 3-foot gap and about an 18 to 24 inch external fence. Both of them have hot wires, and you got to think about whenever you're doing an electric fence, you have to put a hot wire at the nose level of the animal you're trying to keep out. But a deer or elk can clearly jump over this. The advantage of this fence is it's actually using the really horrible depth perception of those animals to its advantage. So a deer or an elk will walk up to that, walk into the fence, get shocked. They'll be like, okay, and they'll come back and they'll try to go under it and they'll get shocked. What they'll do is they'll look at that fence and go, man, I can't tell how far away that interior fence is. I don't know if I can make it. They also can't tell if they can jump in between the fences and then jump over the next one. So it will work at keeping deer out, even though it's very short, and it's way more effective than the double wire fence down there in the bottom picture. This pretty much will keep anything out. It also works pretty well on diggers because they usually only dig under one and they won't dig under both. Raccoons, squirrels, coyotes, if you get the juice high enough, talking, up over 8,000, 10,000 volts, it'll keep bears out. So it's a really good design. Obviously, if you have trees overhanging any of these fences, it leaves an entry point for things like raccoons or squirrels. So you want to make sure you keep that clear, both on the ground and above it. So we get into our smaller ones that we can exclude. So things like rabbits, voles, and other small rodents. You have to think of us in a couple of different ways. Where there's one, there's going to be many. That's the one thing that rodents do is they reproduce, and they reproduce fast and in high numbers. That's because they get eaten so quickly. They're pretty adaptable to a variety of conditions, and they have quite diverse diets. And when they're not diverse, there's another mammal that fills that niche. So we'll see things like chewing on seeds when they're planted, going in, and that gentleman there is looking at squirrel damage to pumpkins. We got some rabbit damage there at the base of I think that was a tomato plant. You get into potatoes and other vegetables where you'll start noticing things like there's a vole rodent hole there at the picture on the far right where the potatoes are that they're looking at. You'll see those kind of signs, and you look at the damage in the plant from the rabbit. They have very clear straight across cuts on all their plants, and that's because they have both the top teeth are making those cuts. There's some solutions, especially for voles and mice, for smaller areas. So if you're trying to protect trees in an apple orchard or along your driveway, you can actually create, about a 3-foot area around your tree, the base of your tree, to protect the roots and protect the trunk of the tree from being girdled by voles and rabbits by putting rocks there and keeping spaces open and grass mowed short. You can do metal welded wire, very small gaps around those as well. But those cultural practices actually go a pretty long way for many of these situations. You can also try to do things like promote natural predation, whether that's from raptors. You can do things like put up raptor boxes like kestrel boxes or barn owl nesting boxes, or things like raptor perches to try to get those birds in that area more frequently. You can hopefully increase usage by things like foxes, coyotes, and bobcats. I tell our soybean producers in central and western Kentucky, where they have a lot of issues with voles in soybean fields, a coyote in the winter will eat 18 voles a day. So a barn owl in nesting season, when it has chicks, will bring over 4 dozen rodents back to that box each day when those chicks are growing to feed the entire family. They bring back and kill and consume a lot of rodents. Okay. The problem here is that you can't have it both ways, where you're hoping the predators come in and knock them back, and also you want to use rodenticides. Those rodenticides, if you put them out, work their way up that chain, and it's actually really knocked back our barn owl population to the point where we're starting to worry about whether or not they're going to be viable. So choose one. Don't try to do both. Follow labeled instructions on the rodenticide, but try to limit its exposure to other wildlife that is in the area. One of the great rodenticides we do have for things like voles, this really should be used more for production systems like blueberries, apple orchards, with zinc phosphide. It's a great option. It's super effective. However, it's a restricted use and it's quite dangerous. If we would consume a couple of these pellets, it would kill us as well, because when it touches moisture, it releases a gas, and that gas is what actually kills the animal. A lot of the other rodenticides are more anticoagulants, so there's consumption over time, and it eventually thins their blood out to the point where they will hemorrhage to death. And those are the ones that actually cause our predators problems, because the animals start behaving really erratically right before they die when they're at the highest levels. So we always say, if you have a smaller population, if you can find the population early on, find those areas where you have the mice, the voles, you can use a simple mouse trap and trap them out. Put a peanut butter, some oats on it, put it at the openings, and you trap until you don't catch a vole for 3 days or a mouse for 3 days. And that, now on a larger scale, it gets a lot harder. And if you are on a larger scale, you may want to talk to your agent about options. When we talk about that zinc phosphide, you want to make sure you follow those labeled directions, and sometimes you have to use a bait distribution station. One is pictured there, simple PVC, and you anchor that down so something like a raccoon can't come up and flip it over and get all the bait out. There's a cap. You put the bait in the top there of the tee, and you close the cap back on it, and the hole's only big enough for the rodents to get in. And if it's anchored, other animals can't get to it. So simple little things like that go a long way in protecting your non-targets. This one's thrown in for yard damage. Moles actually are insectivores. They're eating a lot of the things that you don't want in your areas, the grubs that become insect pests. However, unfortunately, their tunnels and their mounds can be unsightly and cause issues with lawns. Uh, so if you want to get rid of them, you can try to kill the grubs and worms and insects that are in your yard. Uh, that can be quite difficult, because especially when you talk about worms. But it's one way you can try to limit moles from coming in the area. And make sure you are identifying mole damage versus vole damage, because a lot of times people think they have moles, and what they really have are voles, which are quite a bit more destructive. And what you do for moles will not solve the vole issue. So things that are quite effective with moles, they make the little worm baits, the trypanoid. Oh, I can never remember the name of the ingredient within them. They are really effective. The great thing about them is that you put them in the actual tunnels, so non-targets will not ever come in contact with them if you do it as labeled. And what you want to do is with all of these, whether that be the rodenticide or the various traps that exist, you want to find the area the mole is actually in. These guys will have a half-acre home range, and they're solitary animals. So they'll make a very large tunnel system, but only be in a very small segment of that tunnel system for over short periods of time. So you want to step on the tunnels on the first day and find where they get pushed up the second, and that's where that mole is at that time, and that's where you want to put your bait or your trap. Skunks, groundhogs, armadillos are now a thing we have to talk about, and raccoons, which I would say is probably our largest issue within Kentucky when you look at the entire state. These can be wide-ranging problems, especially with raccoons, and we can have. Oh, sorry, I see a question here. How can you tell if you have moles versus voles without seeing one? So most of the time, you will never actually see either of those things. You will only see the paths. So voles with a V will have tunnel systems and runways that are right at the surface of the ground, and they'll have about ping pong to tennis ball sized holes throughout those tunneling systems. And that's a really good indication of a vole issue. Moles will have, as seen in the picture up at the top, you'll see tunnels and trails that run around where you have dirt that's basically pushed up, but not at the top of the surface of the ground. Or you'll see these mounds where they have deeper tunnels, and they're actually pushing the soil up so that they can make those tunnels. You probably won't see either of them. Sometimes you'll see voles when you have incredibly high densities, and they'll be out feeding during the daytime because they have to, because there's a lot of competition for food. Moles, you'll actually see them if you get a lot of rain and the ground is basically saturated. They'll come more to the surface and sometimes come out on the surface at that time. That answer your question? Yep. Okay, good. And then I see I have one about shrews. So shrews are nasty. Let's put it that way. And I've gotten quite a few folks that have sent me pictures of shrews this year, or one that's my neighbor that brought it to my house on 3 separate occasions. Shrews are insectivores / carnivores. They have incredibly high metabolisms, fast metabolisms. They need to eat almost every couple minutes or they won't survive. You're talking about if they haven't eaten in 2 hours, they're probably going to be dead. And they mostly eat beetles, worms. However, if they come across a smaller mammal, like a baby mouse or baby bird that can't get away from them, they'll actually consume those as well. And they're because of their nature as being hyper aggressive, they're solitary. They will spend most of their time underground. or at the surface, sometimes they're at night coming up to feed if they can find things on the surface. However, they don't generally cause producers like gardeners problems, and they don't make a lot of their own holes. So they're one that's more of an incidental. However, folks will come across them sometimes during spring, especially when the juveniles first come up. You have to be very careful with the shrews because they're our only venomous mammal. So you do not want to be, if you have a shrew, which will have a short tail. I don't have a picture here. We'll have a short tail and a long nose. Um, I see Shad's got a good comment there. I'll get to it in a second here, Shad. They'll actually, they'll have that longer nose. It looks somewhat like a mouse in the length, and be actually a little bit broader at the base, and shorter than the mouse. And it'll peter out and come more narrow out a little bit quicker than a mouse will. But their tails will be much shorter. Where a vole doesn't have a tail, but it doesn't have a rostrum, the nose, to go with it. So you want to look at those two features to tell if you have a shrew. So if you have a short tail with a long nose, that's a shrew. If you have a long tail with a long nose, it's a mouse. If you have a short tail with no nose, it's a vole. So yeah, I've caught, Chad mentioned here, he's caught them in his garden with catch-all traps baited with bird seed. They are buzzing around, and that's when usually folks run into them. Is they'll run into traps incidentally. They'll be probably running around that area in the garden looking for bugs and worms, and they'll run through the trap. They are like nonstop motoring machines. When we try to catch them for wildlife research, you can't bait them into traps usually. The best trap we use is a pitfall, where you dig a hole in the ground, they just fall in, because they don't respond well to baits. So my guess is they're in there trying to catch a bunch of other things and happen to run across your traps, because they cover so much ground. However, it could be that they were trying to check out what you had on the trap itself too. So back to skunks and groundhogs, armadillos, and raccoons. All right, there we go. Some of these are relatively easy to trap and deal with in terms of trapping, at least. Raccoons, though they cause a lot of problems and are very hard to deal with up-till trapping because of their dexterous hands. They will bend fences, climb, get into places you never imagine. What they are not good at is avoiding being caught. They're too curious, so they'll end up going in many traps very easily. Things like skunks are relatively easy to catch. However, you caught a skunk, and that means you have to deal with the skunk. So how do you deal with a skunk that's in a trap? Well, they make certain traps that make it easy, like this tube one where they can't spray you. But if you end up catching them in a box trap, they could probably lift their tail up and deliver the thing you're thinking of, and cause a lot of problems and a couple tomato baths. The best thing you can do is, if you catch a skunk, is actually to walk up to it very slowly and talk in a very soothing voice, and talk slow and calm. And their eyesight's really poor, so if you don't surprise them, generally they stay relatively calm, and you're able to them to throw a blanket or a tarp over them and able to pick up the traps. And so basically, if they can't see you and you're keeping things calm and mellow, they're less likely to spray and cause a problem. Okay. And you'll run more into problems with skunks if you have grubs in your yard. They'll dig holes in the ground looking for those grubs, and it's really unsightly. Other times they can cause issues with beehives. Sometimes they'll try to get into those and irritate it. They'll get into gardens sometimes, not as much. They're much more grub eaters, or honey. Sometimes they'll get into dog and cat food as well. They're not dumb animals. They're pretty intelligent. They just have a really poor sense of eyesight. Raccoons, cage traps work really well. Footholds work really well. Dog-proof traps work great. Um, just make sure you're cautious. You don't want to get bit. You guys are right there at the rabies line. If you're in the Kentucky side, you're on the good side. The Virginia side, you get a little bit hairier over there. I'm not quite exactly sure where the line is on that side of the border. I just know it's close. So we don't want to be moving them around. And with any of these animals, when I talk about trapping them, we do not want to trap and relocate. We want to dispatch these animals in the most humane way possible and dispose of them. If you move an animal around, you're moving any of the diseases it's carrying, any of the ticks it's carrying, the parasite load. So you're potentially moving that through the landscape. You're also creating a social disruption wherever you let that animal go. Though it may be great habitat, other raccoons in that area are not going to welcome a new raccoon with open arms and be best friends. They are going to fight and sort out the social hierarchy, which generally leads to injuries, and injuries in the wild often equal death or a lot of suffering. So we never really want to trap and relocate these guys, and that's why trapping really should be your last resort. I do have a picture of a drift fence there for armadillos. Armadillos can cause a lot of damage with their digging. Um, they don't respond to traps or bait well at all. So what people will do is they actually put a fence up in an area the armadillo walks through, and the door will be open on the edge of that fence. So the armadillo hits the fence, follows the fence, and walks right into the trap. That's the best way to catch armadillos. Quickly go over some of the types of traps. I mentioned several of them, but common ones you should know about for basically what we talk about is the foothold, which is the bottom left there. There's two types. There's the long spring and the coil spring. The long spring is just a long spring, as the name talks about. That's pictured on the left. The coil spring has little coils that power the jaws to close. Body grip or conibear trap is the top left there. And that's basically a set of springs that pushes bars down on the animal as it goes through those bars to either hopefully break the neck of the animal, causing an immediate death, or quickly basically suffocating the animal and cutting off blood flow through the pressure of those springs. We commonly talk about traps in either a live trap or a kill trap. So the conibear is what we call a kill trap. A foothold, a box trap is what we would call a live trap. A dog-proof trap, which is pictured there in the bottom right, is something that we would call, some folks will call that a live trap because you can let animals go that are caught in it. Basically, a raccoon will stick its hand in that hole, pull a trigger, and the spring pops up and holds it in place. However, a lot of times that force will actually break that animal's hand. Though you can let it go, it'll probably not be in great shape. I like to say if you catch it in that, you should dispatch it. Now, if you catch a larger raccoon, that spring does its job and holds that animal in place, just like a foothold trap. The foothold traps will basically hold that animal in place so it can't go anywhere. It doesn't actually apply enough pressure to cut off circulation or cause that animal any suffering while it's caught. It will not want to be there, but it's not in pain at that location where it's trapped, as long as the trap is the correct size. There's other traps like tunnel traps and colony traps. Colony traps are used a lot for things like muskrats or squirrels and attics. Tunnel traps are things that you can put in either, it's basically a tube with a conibear inside of it. And you can put those for squirrels in trees, for squirrels and tree limbs. You can put them in mole runways. You can put them basically anywhere that's enclosed space that creates a tunnel-like appearance. When we talk about box traps and footholds, make sure you choose that right size, because if you don't, it becomes very difficult. And there's a lot of things listed right here. If you want any information relative to what's in this talk, please email me at the email me, and I can provide you any of this information. But just the big point here is know that you need to choose the appropriate size for the animal you're after. When we talk about bird and bird issues, this gets complicated pretty quick because of federal protections on almost all of our bird species in either Virginia or Kentucky. They were all protected in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918. So you talk about, it's about 300 birds in Kentucky at any given time of the year. Almost 300 of those are protected entirely because of this federal law. Now, there's a lot of species and there's a lot of behaviors that exist, and there are always some kind of birds around. And what we grow in our gardens and our fields is food, and it's food to them, and they're going to be interested. So you have to be alert to it. Now, there's some options. You can keep them out of certain areas pretty effectively. We see this a lot with our berry producers or our vineyards. Netting works quite well as long as you're checking it on a regular basis and making sure there's no holes in it, and it's spaced appropriately away from what you're protecting. Birds will figure out where the gaps are or where they're close to the food and get to it and still gain access. You can use some deterrents. Now these are really, those lasers and propane cans work great, but they're really expensive. Things like scarecrows and balloons with eyes will work quite well, but they're short-term effectiveness. Now, one of the things that we will use or recommend quite a bit for things like vulture issues or crow issues are effigies. Those birds actually have the awareness of seeing an animal that looks like them and seeing that something is wrong, and they make a link that means there's something potentially not right in the area and there could be danger, so they're less likely to feel relaxed enough to land and feed. So we talk to cattle producers. We tell them that, as they're getting ready to calf, they might want to put an effigy up in that calving pasture. Make sure it's visible from anywhere that cow could give birth. And if it's not, you want to put up another one so that you have complete coverage. And you don't want to leave it up. So if you can tighten up those calving windows so that you're dropping calves around the same time, then those effigies, if those birds don't know they can get to it, or they haven't already fed on a cow or a calf or try to go after them, are pretty effective. They'll also work on things like vulture roosts. That's where we're taking that effectiveness from the vulture roost and applying it to the calving situation. And crows will respond to it as well. Now, if you get a permit from the Farm Bureau, one of the sub-permits that's out there, and you fill that permit, you don't want to just let that bird lay and throw it away. You want to hang that bird up to use in that fashion. And we have the publication available on how to create an effigy for vultures or crows. The only difference that you want to do is just not paint the crow one out of stall mats, and it takes about an hour, and it's about $25 ish to make. We've heard pretty good or gotten pretty good feedback on their effectiveness, and unfortunately, it's the way things are. It's hard to track that with hard data. A lot of folks aren't reporting when they have problems, and that's one thing we do want is we can't solve the problem if the folks aren't telling us how big it is and we're guessing. So if you have a problem, please have them report it to the local FSA office or USDA office. All right, so deer and elk issues. I had to throw elk in here. When I give this talk, it's not always in the elk zone. So a lot of times you're talking about tree damage. With elk, it could potentially be a lot more damage than trees. We have a lot of problems on Robinson Forest with our weather stations and them tearing them up with their antlers. It's new growth, plantings, gardens, row crops, hay fields. It could be potentially a lot of different things. And unfortunately, you basically have two options. You can either exclude them. This is especially true with deer. You can exclude them, or you can hunt and increase that hunting pressure and that lethal control. Deterrence will work for both of them over short periods of time. Fencing for smaller areas works quite well. That offset fence that I was talking about, the offset electric fence, costs about $1,000 to protect right around an acre. It's well worth it if you're doing large scale production. Backyard gardens, that's up to you. Bears, yeah, if you want to keep bears out because they'll be completely gone, that'd be a good idea. If you have beehives, you want to make sure you have electric fencing around those beehives. And I don't know if Fish and Wildlife is continuing the program they had, but they used to provide, if you called them and asked, they had some electric fencing units they are given out each year to protect beehives. So not a great option with keeping them out, but the best thing you do is exclude them if at all possible. Outside of that, heavy hunting pressure, try to make sure that they aren't getting used to people being around and make them uncomfortable as best you can. If you're having deer issues, what you don't want to be doing is feeding deer on your property, or hopefully if your neighbor's feeding deer, then you can talk to them about not feeding deer over the summer while you're potentially trying to grow your produce and keep them out of the area as much as possible. Beavers, this is one that you are not immune to down there. These guys have made an amazing recovery population-wise over the last several decades. And unfortunately, these are your number one environmental engineers after humans. They can do some damage and quickly. They're long-lived and quite good at what they do when it comes to felling trees and building dams and backing water bodies up. And water damage is quite hard to control, especially if it's on your neighbor's property and they love beavers. That's a sticky situation and no clear path on how to deal with that. So what you want to do, though, is if you do find beavers on your property, you want to be looking for them first off. If you have sweet corn or any kind of low-lying areas with a river, because they will find those areas and back them up. So you want to constantly be alert. If you do start seeing rising water levels, walk it, look for a dam. And if you find the dam, you obviously want to get rid of that dam, but before you get rid of it, you want to use that to your advantage to try to trap those beavers and get them out of there. Usually these guys, if they're new to the area, will pair up. The way their life cycle works is mom and dad will have a set of kits, two to four. They will stay with them for 2 years, but they'll have a litter every year. So there'll always be mom and dad, usually the year-old juveniles, and then the new kits that are there. At 2 years old, those juveniles leave and they go find their own area and set up their own dam and find their own mate, and continue on. So you could have anywhere from 1 to 2 beavers to upwards of a dozen beavers in one dam and one den. So you want to make sure that you're staying on top of it, find it early before there's an entire family. Look for things like tracks, their dams, feed piles, which are basically, you'll see right there in the picture where he's pulling up a whole bunch of tree branches to eat in one spot. You'll see corn there sometimes. Easy to see trails where they come in and out of the water. They'll also create castor mounds, which is where they actually put their castor from their glands on their rump, on a big pile of mud to communicate to the other beavers in that area. If you don't have a way of lethally getting rid of them, you can exclude them from things like drainage pipes. You can basically build a buffer around the drainage pipe so they can't actually block the pipe itself up. They respond to the sound of water, running water. So they'll go and try to stop that sound. That's how they're hardwired. They literally will respond to that sound. People have put a recording of water running in an area, and beavers will actually pile up debris on top of that speaker that's creating that sound. There are a couple non-lethal options, like I said, so you have that there. There's a lot more lethal options. Thankfully, these guys are relatively easy to catch before you educate them. So if you miss, if you have an issue where you don't catch them right off the bat with the trap and they learn, that trap is negative, then they get a lot harder. However, you can use things like the Conibear, the 330 Conibear set. Picture at the top, they have a box trap that's especially designed for beavers and otters called the Comstock trap, and you can put that right in the middle of their slide and they'll walk right inside. And then you can use things like footholds and snares. Footholds, you want to be using giant footholds because their feet are about as big as your hand, stretched out. They have huge feet that are webbed. They're super powerful, so you want to use a huge trap. And what you do is basically have that trap on a wire. The beavers go down, jump in the water when they're caught, and there's a locking mechanism that's attaching the trap to the wire, and it doesn't allow them to come back up. They're, though they're not great, They are actually, if you trap them, quite tasty. The meat is quite tender and tasty. And a lot of folks that are trappers will actually trap beaver more for the meat rather than their pelt. Their pelt prices are really low, but their meat value and table fare is quite high. So coming closer to the end here, some of the things that you need to know regulation-wise, we have a law within Kentucky that's quite powerful for citizens. It's Regulatory Statute 150.170. And this provides landowners the right to protect themselves or their property from wildlife damage or wildlife assault, basically. The only thing that this doesn't apply to is federally protected species. So your migratory birds, your raptors, and your endangered and threatened species, which for us in Kentucky are bats. And then, if you have the darter that, is in the water, I don't think it can attack you. So I don't think that would fall under this. But bats and, so you want to make sure that if you have a bat problem, you really want to call a professional in, even, because of this, but also because of the potential for rabies issues. The catch with this law, the only catch, is that you must report any animal to Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife that is normally reported by hunters when they're harvested. So deer, bear, elk, and turkey, if you use this regulation on those species, and you are able to, you just have to call either your county CPO, conservation police officer, or game warden up and get a confirmation number for them. When you use this law, you do not have to dispose of the animal into the garbage or let it lay. You are allowed to consume what you have off that animal. So if you use a deer in your soybean field and you shoot it, you don't have to leave it lay in the soybean field. They actually want you to get that confirmation number and either eat that deer or take it and donate it to Hunters for the Hungry. Same kind of applies for the other ones. You can if you have that confirmation number, you can give it to someone that that would want it. The catch to it is you can only consume the meat and keep the meat, right? You can't keep pelts, and you can't keep antlers, and you can't keep skulls. Any part that's non-consumptive has to be destroyed or surrendered. Any questions on that regulation? All right, so I'll wrap things up and I'll give you more time for questions if you want, if any pop up. Really, the big thing here that I want to kind of drive home is you need to know that a combination of measures are going to provide you the best outcome, most successful outcome, using deterrence, using behavioral changes on your end, exclusion devices, and if you need to trap the animals that are causing your problems, that'll lessen the total issues you have with wildlife in long term. If you're doing, I talk about trees, but if you have wildlife issues, you need to know what's causing that problem in order to pick those successful measures. So put a lot of time and effort in identifying what's going on and causing the problem you're dealing with. That's going to pay off in the end. Because if you don't have the right species, the measures that you're trying to put in place may not be the most effective. When we talk about a lot of the species that cause problems, things like raccoons, deer, hunting or trapping your property will help lessen those populations while still using that resource that's out there. And it really is a must when you're talking about deer control. You folks down there don't have as many deer, but they can still cause problems. So hunting a property will lower those populations and less mouths to eat your food or cause problems. So that is a must. And when you think about it, if you're a producer and you have a property and maybe you don't hunt, well, hunt leasing is a very popular activity now among landowners, and it provides an additional income source to maybe overcome the problems that those wildlife species are creating. You guys down there aren't necessarily in the highest paying of areas. You might get $5 to $10 an acre for deer lease, especially if it's a deer turkey lease. It's not going to compare to some of the places out in Western Kentucky that are getting upwards of $50 an acre for a hunting lease each year. But it's still a way to potentially diversify your property income. And if you are allowing people to hunt and you have deer problems and they're only shooting bucks, your population will never be controlled. They need to shoot adult does to knock populations back. That's your fawn producers that are most successful. Need to shoot does. That could be a lot harder down there given some of the restrictions because of the deer zone you're in. However, it's still possible to do, and you can make that request to anybody that you're allowing hunt your property. There's some other resources that are available, such as the Nuisance Wildlife Control website, located there through Fish and Wildlife, as well as there's an Internet Center for Wildlife Damage Management, where it was about 10, 15 years ago, all the specialists that are in wildlife damage came together and basically pulled all their resources that they had, all the information they could, and put in one spot to make our lives easier to get that information out. So that can be located there at icwdm.org. Here's my contact information. Please feel free to get a hold of me if you're having an issue. You have your agents there, and they're a wonderful resource. And I really do recommend going to them first because they probably can solve the problem without talking to me. However, I am happy to talk to whoever whenever is possible when there's this problem going on. But the best way to get a hold of me is actually go by email, especially now with the entire situation with COVID and where I'm actually working from. Email is the way to go. So I try to respond to that as quickly as possible. And with that, I will stop sharing and be happy to entertain any questions.
Matt, thank you so much. Great information there.
Absolutely.
Any questions?
That makes life easy.
That was pretty thorough.
Definitely.
Given it a few times in the last 4 years, so I've been able to hone it down and try to check off a few boxes. So, but no, I'm not that good. So there's probably one out there at least.
Definitely good information. I think it's something we could, whether you got a garden or whatever. Personally, I've had some beaver issues on the farm, and was able to take care of that. Matter of fact, the agent in service that you and Stacy did in Whitley County actually helped me to eliminate some. So, matter of fact, I was able to use that information within 3 or 4 days after that in service. So,
Excellent.
On the beavers and the sound of the water, there was a special on Netflix or Hulu called Leave It to Beavers.
Yep.
And I don't know if you've seen it, but they talked about that water issue, and they were having problems with the beavers stopping up culverts, drainage culverts. And so they were taking T-posts and driving those T-posts into the water above the culvert so that it would make the ripples and make the sound of water. And the beavers, instead of stopping up the culvert, then they would build the dam up at the T-posts. So you just have to outthink the beaver.
That's really what it comes down to, is outthink the beaver. So yeah, it's once they figured that out, it opened up a lot more solutions to problems. And they're a huge issue. Is when you go further north, it's bad when it comes to road culverts and all the crossings. And it gets scary. Some of the places they have dams, and they are holding back hundreds of thousands of gallons of water with a couple sticks. So
I've seen it. If you go into Maine and New Hampshire and those places, it's unbelievable. I would say probably half their lakes are beaver lakes.
Well, I guess if there's nothing else, any other wildlife, I guess we'll cover snakes next week, right? I believe. So that'll be a fun one.
Very good.
Snake ID next week. Yep, definitely. Matt, thank you so much. Phil, do you want to cover real quick what's going on Thursday evening?
On Thursday, we'll have Kyle Hill. He's from Coburn. He's actually the son of our 4-H program assistant. He's a graduate of the science program at UVA Wise, and also a very avid conservationist and outdoorsman. And he's going to be talking about fishing tackle and techniques, as well as some of the conservation behind fishing. So I think if you fish, or if you have thought about fishing, I think that would be a good one.
Good deal. Sounds good. Well, Matt, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you again next Tuesday.
Thank you very much.
You as well. Everyone have a wonderful rest of their night.
You too.
Exactly. Y'all do the same. Have a good one.
Thank you.